The following show is brought to you in partnership with the Institute of Politics, Policy, and History, Blue Star Strategies, Bright Road Incorporated, Make It Plain Podcast, and RPC Media.
From the campus of the University of the District of Columbia, this is State of Play.
Welcome to State of Play. I'm Sharon Pratt, and with me are Karen Tramontano and the Reverend Mark Thompson. And today we're going to do a very deep dive into the issue of the wealth gap, the wealth divide with African Americans and the larger population, and try to understand and measurably why that divide exists. So we're going to have some great conversation, I think, today to figure out slavery, what the implications, the measurable implications, Jim Crow, the measurable implications, the Homestead Act and the GI Bill, and how somehow African Americans completely missed or significantly missed those opportunities. And, you know, we talk about so many issues, the criminal justice issue, health issues, all of these issues, education issues, almost all of it, in my opinion, just me, you can attribute it to the wealth gap that exists in America, institutionally exists in America, and we tend to treat it like a soundbite. Today, we are going to do a deep dive. So, Karen and Mark, I certainly think you share my thinking that this deserves a lot of attention.
Oh, absolutely, Mayor. And I'm really looking forward to our guest today. Shawn Rochester, I mean, the data that he has is extraordinary. And, you know, we need data to debunk the myths that have been plaguing our nation for 300 plus years. And also, I'm really, really interested in Heather McGhee. Her work, The Sum of Us, really talks about how systemic racism hurts all of us. And how do we change the mindset, especially the mindset of white Americans? I really want to hear her thoughts about that.
I'm looking forward to the conversation as well, because it's going to be important to quantify a lot of what people have yet to hear and understand about systemic racism and systematic racism in this country. But it's not hard for people to know. I think most people know that those of us who are African American suffer disproportionately more from all of the bad things, and then do not enjoy disproportionately less all of the good things. And there's a reason for that. It's not because of us. It's not because of our behavior. It's not because of any shortcomings we have. It's because of the systems that have been put in place. And I'm also obviously looking forward to the conversation with Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee on H.R. 40, the reparations bill, because there is also an argument as to whether or not we can ever resolve any of these issues with conversations on equity alone. For some, reparations is still a controversial word, term, as a matter of fact. But I don't know that we can ever deal with all of the inequities that Shawn Rochester will lay out unless we get serious and finally accept that the answer is reparations. So I'm sure Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee will inform us about that as well.
You know, I sort of always get weary with the notion that when they talk about particularly Black Americans, it's like a synonym for being impoverished. It's how you legitimize being who you are by being impoverished. And this impoverished state was the consequence, as what so many of our guests will outline, very intentional policies. I'm not entirely certain you can attribute it just to racism, because slavery was really about capitalism. And it's unfortunate that those of African descent were the commodity in that capitalist system. And there was a huge price to be experienced as a result of that. And then you had a period when there was supposed to be Reconstruction, but what we got was Jim Crow. And there was a price for that. And it just continued because there was a mindset that was developed around justifying this. I think a lot of it was a psychological justification for what happened in America. So people are not out for retribution. People are out to achieve some level of parity. And I think that Heather McGhee and Sheila Jackson Lee are guiding us on how to do that.
The other important discussion I hope that we're going to have is we went from thinking the role of the federal government was to invest in communities and in build a middle class. And clearly we know that those policies intentionally excluded African Americans. But now we are in a world where nobody is looking at investments of the federal government as a public good. And I think Heather McGhee has this wonderful analogy of public pools and draining the public pools, because we have shifted our thinking to this individualist, everybody pulls themselves up by their bootstraps. And as Shawn Rochester outlined, nobody pulled themselves up by their bootstraps in white America. They were given the GI Bill. They were given land grants. It wasn't this individual accomplishment.
You're right, Karen, that this country has had a lot of policies that created a middle class, but basically a white middle class. So we're going to talk with Shawn Rochester, Heather McGhee, and then Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee to see just how this wealth divide began. So don't go away. There's more to State of Play.
Closed captioning brought to you in partnership with the Institute of Politics, Policy, and History. Visit ipph.org for more information.
Welcome back to State of Play. As you know, our topic today is the wealth divide in America, particularly as it impacts African Americans. We have the perfect guest, Shawn Rochester, the author of The Black Tax. He does an excellent job, possibly the best job I've seen, of really quantifying why it is African Americans, who represent 13% of the population, only represent 2% of the wealth. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Mayor Pratt, for having me on the program, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Well, what I think is so terrific about how you approach it is you go through different junctures in American history and the quantitative implications of each of those junctures for African Americans. So can we do that? First, there was slavery, about 250 years of slavery, the impact and import of that.
Is about $50 trillion. There's some estimates that place the number as high as 24, others that place it closer to 97. If you look at the midpoint between those two things, it's as high as $50 trillion.
All right, then we go to the Jim Crow period. I mean, there was emancipation, nothing for food, nothing for shelter, nothing to start a farm or a business. But then we have Jim Crow, the implications of that period. About 75 years, was that correct?
Yeah, it's roughly from about 1870 to about 1945 or so of really uncompensated labor. The challenge associated with this construct is that people left emancipation with no economic resources. By 1870, Black people owned about 0.1%, 0.17% of U.S. wealth, effectively nothing, right? And they weren't given the economic resources associated with 40 acres and a mule that we all know about. They were forced into a situation of, it's called slavery by another name, where they were reimposed. 100% tax was reimposed upon them. Basically, the food, the clothes, the shelter, everything that they needed to bring crops to market, they had to borrow from white landowners to be able to do that at rates as high as 70% of the year. When they brought the crops to market, it was the white landowner that set the price. So you got a person who's setting your cost structure. They're setting your revenue or your income, which by definition means that they're setting your profit. So that left them in a situation of 100% tax.
So even when we get beyond that period, let's talk about programs that were designed to basically extend a helping hand to all Americans, such as the Homestead Act. What was the opportunity for African Americans, or lack of opportunity for African Americans, with respect to that act?
Yeah, there was almost no participation whatsoever. The Homestead Act was passed in 1862. It distributed about 246 million acres to roughly about 1.5 million or so white families, right? There's an infinitesimally small amount of that went to any kind of black folks. If you look at that in today's equivalent and you just use farmland pricing, roughly $3,028 to about $6,350 per acre, it'll put you around about $1.6 trillion or roughly $1 million, right, per family, which is an extraordinary start.
Well, then we had World War II, and we had the celebrated Tuskegee Airmen. But when everyone returned, what about the GI Bill? I mean, wasn't that supposed to make itself available to all military personnel?
It was supposed to, and it's a wonderful piece of legislation to serve the needs of people who gave so much. But you had about 1 million soldiers, black soldiers who were returning, who weren't able to benefit from this. So it was a massive infusion of capital that provided job training, funds for college, obviously funds for home ownership. Less than 2% of any of that went to black soldiers.
So if you had to put the total, therefore, I think you came up with an estimate of around 70 trillion that's due, that in order to achieve parity, that is, for African Americans. How do you get non-African Americans, since African Americans only have 2% of the wealth, to really buy, even accept this as a reality, much less do something about it?
I think the first piece of it is for people just to become informed as opposed to spending time affirming kind of their belief system. Most folks think that the reason why people are in the position that they're in is just because of decisions that we've made or not made over the course of time that have led us here. They don't really know about the context that surrounds it. They have no idea what the total amount of labor extracted from people was. They're generally told that bad things happened for a period of time. It came to an end. It was a new start. And what you find is that the form just changes, and it's been continuous. And what I wanted to do was to look at it from a purely economic standpoint, put the emotional aspect aside, and just show people what the numbers are so they could see it in perspective.
Well, I think that's very compelling, because I think, it's so beyond an ism in terms of the African American experience. It was about capitalism and our community with the capital in that system from where I sit. So we're going to continue this conversation because it's so important. So he'll still be here with us when we come back. So don't go away. Come back to State of Play. Welcome back to State of Play. We have Shawn Rochester. I know our team has some questions for you.
Mr. Rochester, you talked about these federal policies. If they were available to African Americans now, would it make a difference?
It would make an enormous difference. We're talking about, massive amounts invested in job training and upskilling, which is really critical for low-income communities. We're talking about significant amounts invested into attaining a college education and doing it in an affordable way, and also significant amounts being invested into home ownership, which we all know is the major wealth driver for Americans. So it would be extraordinarily powerful, and it would reverberate not only through those families, but their communities and the country as a whole.
The Biden administration has made reaching racial equity a priority. In addition to some of the policies that you have laid out, what other policies would you suggest to the Biden administration, whether through executive order or through legislation?
Yeah, so they have a number of policies that they've kind of laid out, put on the books. Their plans are over 40 pages when I kind of read through them. One of the things that I would say is that they need to add more specificity from what I call my PhD economic framework, which just says that policies, plans, and programs should have a direct stimulative impact on job creation, business formation and expansion, and capital availability and affordability within the Black community. If we take low-income housing as an example, the Biden administration is very committed to doing that in a large way. When you apply a PhD economic framework, you also look at who are the contractors that are associated with that. Who are the architects? Who's the general contractor? What are the trades that are being deployed in that? Where are they buying the materials for the build associated with that? Are they utilizing Black realtors when these homes are sold, or Black brokers, insurance agents, and brokers to insure these properties? Or are they using Black financial institutions or any other financial institutions that's providing liquidity into the Black community in terms of the financing of these places? You can have a massive 10x multiplier effect when you bring in Black enterprise and high quality Black service providers into these programs.
So you're really talking about, a complete supply chain, top to bottom lens through which the Biden administration should view this. Can they do it?
They can absolutely do it, right? That's a matter of identifying the firms that have the skill set and a prowess to participate. We know there are extraordinary levels of all of these individuals, whether it's realtors or insurers or builders or architects or designers, that have tremendous skill sets that are massively underutilized, that are incredibly stimulative, right, for job creation and business development within their communities and within their ecosystems. You get a massive multiplier effect when you bring these folks into the mix.
Well, I can think of few topics more compelling than this topic. You really do a brilliant job, a comprehensive job of explaining how it is African Americans find themselves with only 2% of the wealth, though 13% of the population. And having been a mayor of a major city where you deal with issues of crime and health and the like, almost all of it can be ascribed to the economic deficits within the African American community, a community that's only role in the capitalist system for so long was to be that capital. You've done a brilliant job, and we are forever in your debt. Thank you so very, very much.
Thank you, Mayor Pratt. I appreciate it.
Welcome back to State of Play. Shawn Rochester was very compelling. It's hard to argue with the numbers, $50-some trillion in terms of a wealth divide, and very well corroborated. So, Karen and Mark, we've got a lot to chew on in terms of trying to figure out where we take it from here.
Well, Mayor, I think one of the most compelling aspects of Rochester's was that there is this narrative that it's the fault of Black people of where they are, essentially. And what is so compelling is the intentional policy decisions that were made over many, many, many years that benefited white people and not Black people specifically. And I think when Heather McGhee is our next guest, I'm really interested in hearing what she can add to that dialogue.
I enjoyed what Shawn shared with us, Mayor and Karen. And there are 3 steps to doing something about this. There's first getting people educated, getting people organized, and then getting people mobilized. What Shawn Rochester shared is invaluable to that first step, because a lot of people don't know that history. Some people still think that racism is simply rooted in individual hatred. But when we use terms like systemic or systematic racism, a lot of people don't understand what that means. What Shawn laid out for us is the definition of systemic and systematic racism in policy that cut African Americans out of being a genuine part of the middle class. It also explodes the myth, the other part of that myth, Karen, that it's our fault. The other part of that myth is that white Americans just naturally pulled themselves up completely on their own by their own bootstraps, as opposed to there being real investment in the white middle class. So again, that explodes the Cabbage Patch myth that the white middle class was just found under a Cabbage Patch. No, there was investment, intentional investment, and rightfully so, in building a middle class for this country. We wouldn't be anywhere without a middle class. But the fact is that African Americans were left out. And I think the more people hear that and understand it, they say, well, yeah, wait a minute, that makes sense. Wealth in America, in the middle class, is determined by home ownership. And look how much we've been left out of that. So Shawn's information is invaluable in that education process.
Well, I think he did a great job of chronicling how at various junctures in American history, that deficit did occur, whether it's slavery, Jim Crow, or even the initiatives in the wake of World War II. And I think, Karen, you've often raised, how do we get white America to understand they too were hurt by a lot of these intentional policies. So I'm really glad that we're going to have Heather McGhee, who talks about how she has talked with a lot of folks in white America about the implications of some of these policies. I'm also glad we're going to have Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, who is pushing this initiative around a commission to talk about reparations as a way to, not to heal this country, bridge the wealth divide, achieve a level of reconciliation that we in America so desperately need. So this has been a purposeful conversation. So don't go away with State of Play. Welcome back to State of Play. We're very lucky indeed to have Heather McGhee join us for this part of the conversation. She is a great thought leader and the author of The Sum of Us. As you know, what we're talking about is the wealth divide. How did it come to pass? And then we're going to talk about how do you address it. But as Heather McGhee knows better than most, we live in the world of politics and public policy. How do you get buy-in to have people really want to address this? Heather, what are your thoughts?
Oh, thank you so much for this conversation. In my book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together, I lay out the facts that the biggest impediment to economic progress in our society is this zero-sum worldview, the idea that progress for some people has to come at the expense of others. It's a counterfactual idea. It isn't actually accurate. It's held more often by white folks than people of color. We don't think that our progress has to come at white folks' expense. And of course, the data doesn't bear it out. The racial economic divides that you're talking about are actually costing our overall economy trillions of dollars every year. We would all do better if we were all doing better. And yet it's that racist zero-sum story that keeps many white people actually voting against and rooting against the kinds of investments in public goods and public benefits that could help them and their own families, just because it might also help the people that they see on the other side of that zero-sum divide. That's what's costing us trillions of dollars for everyone.
And that's being driven, as I understand it from your book, Heather McGhee, by a narrative, a public narrative that, don't look to government, that you should look to the private sector. And that narrative kicked in once the demographics of the public began to change. Is that a fair takeaway?
That's exactly right, Mayor. It's this zero-sum story that is being sold for profit by people who are benefiting economically and politically by the status quo. It's the stories about makers and takers, taxpayers and freeloaders, the derision of handouts that I'll note used to be the way we did business in the United States. In the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, the United States invested tremendous amounts of money in public goods, public benefits, and public amenities. parks, schools, even public pools, which is the metaphor at the heart of the Sum of Us. The reminder that this country was built based on massive government investments in white wealth building and a high standard of living for white Americans. And usually those benefits were racially exclusive, like the public pools in so many communities across the country. And when the civil rights movement demanded the integration of those public goods, including the pools, many towns across the country opted to drain their public pools rather than integrate them. I say that that's the metaphor at the heart of my book, because it feels like we're all living in the bottom of a drained public pool now, where we're shortchanging the basic investments in our infrastructure, which gets a D+ from the American Society of Civil Engineers, where we don't have universal health care or childcare or paid family leave. We've let our minimum wage stagnate. We've let the government turn its back on the economic security of all of our people. And that's mainly because of a massive shift in public opinion by white Americans who went from championing the New Deal Democratic Party to turning their backs on the Democratic Party once it became the party of civil rights under Lyndon Johnson, after which they never again voted in the majority for a Democrat for president.
Heather, that your metaphor is compelling. How do we begin to shift this thinking? And in particular, in your conversations, do you hear a shift in thinking among white Americans?
Well, that was the question. That was really the question that set me off on the journey. I took 3 years traveling across the country to write The Sum of Us. I talked to Americans, Black, white, and brown, who shared their stories of triumph and of struggle, of really taking on the toxic mix of racism and greed in this country. I'm reminded of time I spent with a white woman named Bridget Hughes, lifelong fast food worker, struggling with 3 kids on a minimum wage paycheck, her and her husband. And she had grown up with that zero-sum story, right? The idea of us and them, the idea of immigrants coming and stealing jobs, the idea of Black folks committing crimes and being, dependent on welfare. And yet when she began organizing to make her own life better with the fight for $15 in a union in Kansas City, she began to see herself in the lives of her Black and brown coworkers for the first time. She recognized that there were so many more things that they had in common than what held them apart. And as she told me, I no longer see that it's an us and them. Right now, I understand that for us to come up, she said, we've all got to come up, Black, white, and brown. She said, as long as we're divided, we're conquered. And that's really it. That's really the story, I think, that could help create a multiracial working and middle class coalition to refill the pool of public goods for everyone. Things like universal health care and childcare, a decent minimum wage, the right to collectively bargain, which is something I tackle in the book, The Sum of Us, the way that racism is used as a wedge to keep workers apart. Things like affordable college. We used to pay for the cost of college on the government tab back when the college-going population was white and male. As it became more diverse, governments cut back, and now we've got this debt for diploma system that impacts Black families worse because of the wealth gap that we've been talking about, but also 6 out of 10 white students now have to borrow. So there is this solidarity dividend, as I talk about in the book, that I think we can really unlock when we realize that there are common solutions to our common problems and that racism has a cost for everyone.
If one is an everyday, average, working class African American listening to all of this alarming information, what can she or he do in the meantime while we try to figure out some policy answers to these questions?
That's such an important question. I think that oftentimes we look for individual solutions to what are actually, public policy problems. We tell people to go back to school. Well, that costs money because the government has pulled back on supporting it. We tell people to get a better job. There are some good jobs out there, but they're harder and harder to come by. And the more you work, the more you need childcare and transportation, right? We have stacked the deck so hard against individual working folks that I would say the most important thing you can do is organize, because everywhere you look, there is someone else who's got those same problems. And it's only through collective action that we can really change our own life circumstances.
Heather McGhee, you've been terrific. Your insights have been on it, and we're all the better for it. So don't go away with State of Play. Next, we speak with Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, where she'll talk about the Commission on Reparations.
Closed captioning brought to you in partnership with the Institute of Politics, Policy, and History. Visit IPPH.org for more information.
Welcome back to State of Play. We are truly honored. We have with us today the Honorable Sheila Jackson Lee. Thank you so very much for being with us, and thank you for your tremendous leadership on this important issue.
Thank you. And Mayor, thank you for your leadership. I was here in Congress doing your stupendous leadership of the city.
Congresswoman, you are providing great leadership on H.R. 40, this commission to study reparations. Is this about retribution for slavery, or is it about bridging the wealth divide in America?
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. H.R. 40 is as American as apple pie and sweet potato put together. It is as American as African Americans, Black Americans are to the heritage and the institution building of this nation. We modified H.R. 40 because we understood it had to be legislation for the 21st century. Yes, it will deal with the original sin, which is an apology, which has never been done to those who were held in bondage for more than 200 years. And then we move to action, and that is that it funds the study. You have to dig deep to be able to understand why there's such stark disparities with African Americans in the 21st century, why it has transcended centuries that we are still in this time showing stark disparities. And so it studies, but then it acts upon developing reparation proposals. And those proposals may reach a wide gamut of the issues of concern in the Black community, from healthcare to education, to science and to psychology, to sociology, and of course the big one, the disparities in wealth.
So you have this commission. Who gets to decide who's on this commission? And, once they're on the commission, what is the process for making decisions?
So this gives me an opportunity to say that we will not be knocking on our neighbor's door and asking our neighbor to give us compensation or response to slavery. That's what's so perfect about this legislation. Slavery was government sanctioned, the slave codes, for how long? Families were separated, brutalized, beaten, and hung under the auspices of the government. In one instance, it was the United States of America, then it became the Confederacy. So this will be a government commission, and it will be appointed by the majority leader of the United States Senate, who at this instance supports H.R. 40, the Speaker of the House, who supports H.R. 40, and of course, the President of the United States, who has made it very clear that his will be the administration of racial equity and racial justice. And so those individuals will combine to select this commission. It will have a staff, funding, and we hope also that there will be hearings, will be fact-finding. We'll give the pros and the cons. We'll let those who have deep disagreement be heard, but as well the scholars and the historians and those that can bring real documentation that exists on what Black people, what slaves, and now the descendants of enslaved Africans went through during their time here in the United States.
And again, Congresswoman, I know this is sort of going to be a tough one, but this decision-making process, is it going to be by majority vote? Is it going to be inspired by the Kerner Commission? How does it really work?
It will be by, we hope, consensus, but there will be votes, and it will be votes that will be taken by the majority. But what will happen, Mayor, is that the actual infrastructure of how it works will be crafted by those who will be selected to serve, so that they can design with the guidance of the legislation, the weeds of how they will vote, members being absent, the final report, but there will be no letting up of this being a very serious a commission with official work that will have to be done on behalf of the American people.
Congresswoman, I so applaud your leadership on this particularly difficult subject or challenging subject. But, you know, it's such a polarized country. Even if every single recommendation is by unanimous vote, how do you get America to buy into it?
I think we're moving toward that with the huge numbers of young voters and minority voters who voted in 2020 that will be rising to be leaders. Young voters were the ones that have challenged their universities, Harvard and Georgetown, for using slaves to help fund the institutions. In fact, you probably could not find an Ivy League school that might not have had that exposure. I don't want to say all, I just want to say that it occurred. So many institutions in the United States were funded and survived because of slave work, which created wealth. Certainly the transatlantic slave trade was one of the components of building of the wealth in the South, the landed wealth, as well as the Wall Street banks. I think as people hear the facts, they will understand there is a question of equity and fairness, and that we are not taking away from my neighbor or my neighbor's child.
Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, you are such a wonderful leader, and we at State of Play have been so honored to have you with us today. Thank you so very much for all that you do. So don't go away. There's still more to State of Play. Welcome back to State of Play. Mark and Karen have some questions for you, Congresswoman.
Good to see you, Congresswoman. Of course, you inherited this legislation from the great John Conyers, but H.R. 40 has been upgraded, hasn't it? Sort of an H.R. 40 2.0, because this legislation not only deals with the period of enslavement, but with all the other periods that comprise the vestiges of enslavement. Lynchings, Jim Crow, etc. Correct?
Reverend Mark, you're so right. And as I was saying just before we started, the idea of HR 40 is to be reparative, it is to restore, it is to heal, and it is to acknowledge that the wealth disparities between Black Americans and white Americans cannot be denied. So what we're trying to do, of course, with all of this is to show that we can not only deal with the apology of the original sin, but we're going to take America along a journey to show that we document the disparities. In fact, we just got handed to us a Harvard University medical school peer-reviewed study that said that if reparations had been given before COVID-19, we would not have seen the high numbers of death, hospitalization, and infection in the African-American community. Guess what? Without that high number, we would have also brought down the number of infections and death in the broader community, other segments of our community. And so I've always said about HR 40, the Commission to Study and Develop Reparations, you lift one boat, you lift all boats. That's what we want to do. We don't do this in anguish. We don't do this with anger. We do this with the idea of healing America and bringing America into her full promise of the 21st century and centuries to come.
Congresswoman, thank you for your determination on this legislation. But let me ask you, can we have equity in America without reparations?
No, we cannot have equity, healing, unity without justice, without practical solutions, without action. HR 40 is action, because at that last point on the name of it, develop reparation proposals, which may be a wide breadth of issues dealing with eliminating redlining, creating more access to credit, saying that HBCUs would never close and there'd always be an opportunity for education, ensuring the access to the kind of work that grows wealth, housing, more medical care that we did not have during COVID-19, which evidenced itself in the high numbers of death. And of course, we will not tell the commission not to decide on what other reasonable compensation that they would want, but we will not let the definition of the payments that are being promoted to bring this down. What we're going to say is We're going to listen to the payment advocates, but it is not our decision. It is that of the commission. And the commission may find another way to make everybody happy by answering all of the disparities and for once and for all, getting into the seated, long-standing disparities and weeds about why we as Black Americans still maintain those disparities, which in many instances, from mass incarceration, let's not leave that out, many instances have stymied our ability as a population to generate into the economic engine of this nation. If we generate into the economic engine of this nation, I can assure you there will be many happy faces that don't happen to look like me. That's why we can't wait.
You've been terrific. That's all we have time for, but thanks for being a part of State of Play. So welcome back to State of Play. As you know, on this episode, we've done a deep dive around the wealth divide in America. And we have been enlightened by Shawn Rochester, who explained how various junctures in American history, that divide just got deeper and deeper. Slavery, Jim Crow, even in the wake of World War II. And the great thing about Heather McGhee is that she explained how these intentional policies, very much designed to create a disadvantage for people of color, have hurt most Americans, and how we ought to get some buy-in from all of America to address it. And Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, who's doing a terrific job of advancing an initiative to address and to begin to deal with reparations by creating a commission, was very, very enlightening and compelling. So is there a hopeful path forward, you think?
So, Mayor, I have to have as a takeaway, how do we get Shawn Rochester's information and Heather McGhee's zero-sum game narrative that we have been oppressed by in this country? How do we get that into everybody's psyche so that people can pull the covers off of what has been going on for literally hundreds of years? And it's hurting all of us. Is it our education system that really needs to begin now talking about these real numbers, and also the narrative, because people are doubling down on this narrative, and it is going to hurt all of us for another couple of hundred centuries.
Karen, I think the way we get it out there is by doing what we're doing right now. And I'm honored to be here with the both of you because we're doing right here what is not happening as much as it should in the Beltway mainstream media. They need to be talking about these issues as well, rather than not covering real issues. For example, the Beltway media was loath to call Donald Trump what he really was, a liar and a racist. They are loath, even at this moment, to use the term voter suppression. As if that's some type of third rail terminology. We've got to get media to follow the lead of what this program you started is doing, Mayor, to call these spades exactly what they are. I think that this helps. I am optimistic about all of the guests and the conversation, especially about H.R. 40. Full disclosure, and Mayor, you know this better than anyone. Well, Karen, you do too. I was married to the H.R. 51 bill for D.C. statehood, but if I have a mistress, it's H.R. 40. And I've been very strongly supportive of that piece of legislation. We have almost 200 co-sponsors. And look, this reparations bill addresses that legacy and that chronology that Shawn Rochester pointed out, all of those things, not just enslavement. So I think that's very important. We're on our way.
No, I think there's reason for hope. And it's important that people be educated, that people, some people weren't enterprising, others weren't. And there's a reason we're all feeling this income inequality even today. Some of these intentional policies have hurt everybody. So I'm very glad we drilled down on this wealth divide at State of Play. So join us again next week. We're going to always dive deeply.